All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a case that's really going to make you think.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. We're going to Agency, Iowa in 2012,
Okay.
and picture this. A young, seemingly happy couple, Lisa and Seth Techel. Lisa's actually 4 months pregnant,
Wow.
and they're living in a trailer on some family land while they're building their dream home.
Oh, okay.
So, pretty idyllic, right?
Yeah, sounds nice.
Well, in the early hours of May 26th, everything changes.
Oh, boy.
We're using a YouTube video from the Channel That Chapter to try to unpack this case.
Okay, cool.
And see what happened. And the big question is, was Lisa's husband Seth a cold-blooded killer, or was this a massive miscarriage of justice?
I mean, right off the bat, this case is strange. You have Seth calling 911. He says he was in the shower, heard a gunshot, and found Lisa dead in their bed.
Just awful.
It's a crazy scene for sure. But the question that really hangs over this whole story is, was Seth really the one who did this, or did the investigation just completely miss the mark?
Yeah, that's what we're here to figure out. And the video starts off by throwing us a total curveball. So Lisa's father, Todd Caldwell, was actually a deputy
Oh,
at the
wow.
Wapello County Sheriff's Office. And right away, his suspicion falls on their neighbor, Brian Tate.
Interesting.
Why Brian? Well, there was this whole feud going on between him and Seth.
Oh,
It was
no.
pretty messy. There was something about a dead deer, and there were even buckets of, dog poop
Ugh.
dumped on Brian's car.
Oh, that's so gross.
Yeah, it was bad.
So it sounds like there was some serious bad blood there.
For sure. And Brian also had a history of PTSD and paranoid schizophrenia.
Oh, wow.
So to law enforcement, and especially to Todd, he seemed like someone who could be, dangerous.
Right.
In fact, Todd had actually responded to calls from Brian complaining about Seth just a few weeks before the murder.
Oh, jeez.
So you can see why they initially thought Brian might be involved.
Yeah, it makes sense. They were looking at the most obvious suspect, I guess.
Exactly. But then the SWAT team, they raid Brian's house.
Dramatic.
It was intense. And they find him totally calm, and he has a solid alibi. He was asleep at home when the murder happened.
Oh, wow.
So that was a huge dead end.
So where did they go from there?
Well, that's when the investigation takes a sharp turn. With Brian out of the picture, all eyes turn to Seth.
Okay, but he's the one who called 911, right? He was the one who found her.
Right. So it seems weird.
Where's the evidence?
Well, there was this seemingly small detail that becomes super important. A friend of Seth's stopped by the house that morning to pick up a puppy that Seth was watching.
Okay.
And he mentioned that Seth had a burner phone and that he'd recently borrowed a shotgun.
That is strange.
Right. It meant to wonder.
It definitely raises some red flags.
Yeah. And this is where things start to unravel for Seth. During his interrogation, his story about what happened that morning keeps changing.
Uh-oh.
At first, he denies any problems in his marriage. He says Brian is the only person they've had issues with.
Okay.
But then, little by little, he starts to reveal more about this relationship he had with a coworker named Rachel McFarland.
So there's another woman in the picture.
Yeah, classic love triangle situation.
Was it a full-blown affair or just like a little flirting?
That's the thing. Seth's story keeps evolving. First, he says it was just flirting, then it was explicit pictures, then a hug, then a kiss.
Whoa.
Finally, he admits that Rachel might have thought he was going to leave Lisa for her.
So he's stringing her along.
It seems that way. And it makes you wonder, if he wanted out of the marriage, why not just get a divorce?
Right. Why go to such extremes?
It's a big question, and it's one the prosecution would later try to use to establish Seth's motive.
Right. They'd have to prove he had a reason to kill her.
Yeah. But before we get into all that, let's talk about the most damning piece of evidence, the shotgun.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He borrowed a shotgun.
Well, guess what? Investigators found it hidden in the trees near the trailer,
Really?
and it was a match for the weapon that killed Lisa.
That's not good.
Nope, not good at all. A borrowed shotgun used in a murder and then hidden near the crime scene.
That does not look good for Seth.
That at all. But, even with all this, Seth insisted he was innocent.
So what happened next?
Well, buckle up, because what comes next is a wild ride. We're talking 3 trials, each one more dramatic than the last. And in the third trial, the defense pulls a move that nobody saw coming.
Oh, I can't wait to hear this.
Yeah, you're not going to believe it. But before we jump into all the courtroom drama, let's go back to the beginning of the investigation.
Okay.
Because the way law enforcement initially zeroed in on Brian Tate, it really raises some questions about bias and tunnel vision.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think contributed to that? I mean, besides the obvious feud and his mental health history.
Well, I think Lisa's father being a deputy played a huge role. He was really involved in the case from the start, and his personal feelings about Brian definitely influenced things.
Right. It's like they were looking for evidence to confirm what they already believed instead of keeping an open mind.
Exactly. And that's dangerous. It shows how easily even experienced investigators can fall prey to biases, especially in emotional cases like this.
It's a good reminder for all of us to check our biases.
Absolutely. So even though Brian was eventually cleared, the way they initially focused on him exposes a flaw in the early investigation. a flaw that could have had serious consequences.
Yeah, that's a bit scary to think about.
It is, and it brings us back to Seth, with Brian ruled out the spotlight shifts and all the inconsistencies in Seth's story, plus that shotgun. It paints a much more complicated picture.
So the question becomes, was Seth a victim of circumstance, or was he playing a very dangerous game?
That's the million-dollar question. And in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to unpack those trials, the defense strategies, and a shocking revelation that shook the courtroom to its core.
Oh man, I'm on the edge of my seat already.
Get ready because it's about to get really interesting. So we left off with Seth at the center of this whole investigation, a borrowed shotgun linking him to Lisa's murder. But remember Seth saying he's innocent. So what happens next?
Well, get this, he goes to trial not once, not twice, but 3 times.
3 trials. Seriously, what was going on? Were the juries just totally stuck or what?
Yeah, the first 2 actually ended in mistrials.
Wow, I didn't know that. What happened?
So in those first couple of trials, the defense really went hard trying to make people doubt the investigation. You know, like how they never tested Seth's hands for gunshot residue?
Right, they kept saying that the investigators were so focused on Seth that they missed other possibilities.
Yeah, that's exactly what they were arguing. Like the police rushed to judgment, especially after going after Brian Tate so hard.
Did they have any other theories about who might have done it, or were they just trying to tear down the prosecution's case?
They tried to bring Brian back into the picture, but remember he had that rock-solid alibi, so it was kind of a stretch. And it didn't really work. The jury wasn't buying it.
So what was different about the third trial? Did something change, or was it just, third time's the charm?
Well, they got a new defense team, and that came with a whole new strategy. They decided to go on the offensive. Instead of just attacking the investigation, they dropped a bombshell. Lisa was having an affair with a coworker named Jason Tennis.
Wait a minute, hold on. Both Seth and Lisa were having affairs. This is getting crazy.
Yeah, it's a twist you don't see coming. And the defense argued that this affair meant Seth didn't have a motive. If Lisa was already cheating, why would he need to kill her?
I see what they're doing. They're trying to make people question whether Seth was really desperate to leave the marriage, maybe even suggesting that this Jason guy had a bigger reason to want Lisa gone.
Right, but did they have any proof that Jason was involved, or was it just speculation?
Good question. Did they?
Well, Jason had a solid alibi, so they couldn't actually connect him to the murder. But the fact that Lisa was having an affair, it definitely messed with the prosecution's story. It challenged this whole idea that Seth was so desperate to be with his coworker that he'd kill Lisa.
Right, because if they were both unhappy in the marriage and seeing other people, it kind of changes things. So did this new information change the jury's minds? Did it work?
Sadly for Seth, it didn't really have the effect they were hoping for. After deliberating for 4 hours, they came back with a guilty verdict. First-degree murder.
Wow, only 4 hours. Seems like they didn't believe that Lisa's affair meant Seth didn't do it. What about that burner phone, though? Did they ever figure out what Seth was trying to hide with that?
Oh, yeah, they totally connected that to Rachel. They showed the jury text messages where Seth told Rachel to give him 2 weeks. And then the night before the murder, he sent her a text that said, "It's done."
Whoa, that's creepy.
It is, right. It kind of makes it seem like he planned the whole thing.
So they're saying he was being all sneaky and using that burner phone to set everything up, and that "it's done" message just makes it sound even worse.
Yeah, and Seth insisted that the "it's done" text was about something else entirely, but the prosecution said it was proof that he was guilty.
It's all adding up, isn't it? He wanted to be with Rachel, he borrowed a shotgun, he was using a burner phone to talk to her, and then there's that "it's done" message? It's hard to argue with that.
Plus, you have to think about how everything started with them going after Brian Tate. The defense tried to use that to show that the investigators had a pattern of being biased and ignoring important evidence.
Right? They were basically saying that once the police thought Seth did it, they twisted everything to fit that story. But did the jury buy that? Were there still doubts about whether Seth really did it?
Well, the verdict kind of answers that question. They found Seth guilty, so it seems like they believe the prosecution's case.
So that's it. Seth is found guilty of first-degree murder. Even though Lisa was having an affair, the jury didn't think that was enough to prove he didn't do it. And poor Brian, he just becomes a sad side story in this whole mess.
It really makes you think about how personal opinions and shortcuts in the investigation can mess up the search for the truth.
It definitely shows that, and even with a guilty verdict, there are still so many questions. Was Seth really a cold-hearted killer, like they said, or did the investigation make a huge mistake?
It's a question people are still talking about today. It just shows how hard it is to really know what happened, especially when it's all behind closed doors.
What about those things they missed, like not testing Seth for gunshot residue? Could that have changed things?
It's hard to know for sure. The prosecution said Seth had time to wash his hands, but the defense said it was a big mistake.
So maybe we'll never know for sure. But this case definitely reminds us how important it is to have investigations that are thorough and fair.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we all have biases and how they can affect what we see and how we judge things. And that's not just for the police, it's for all of us.
That's a powerful thought. And before we move on, we can't forget about the real people affected by all of this.
That's right. Lisa was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and she was taken away. Brian was wrongly accused, and he ended up dying not long after Lisa. And now Seth is spending his life in prison. It's just sad all around.
It's a story that leaves you feeling unsettled because there's no real ending, no clear answers. As we go to the final part of this deep dive, we're going to look at what happened after the trial, the questions that remain, and what this case tells us about justice bias and how complicated relationships can be. Man, we've been through a lot with this Seth Techel case. It's like a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces. You think you're getting somewhere, and then bam, another twist.
Yeah, it definitely keeps you guessing. From that whole thing with the neighbor Brian to Seth's affair and then Lisa's affair. I mean, it's a lot to process.
It really is, and it's hard to walk away from this story feeling like anything is settled, you know. You have Lisa, who has murdered Brian, who was accused for no reason and later died. And then Seth, who's in prison for the rest of his life, but he still says he's innocent. It's just heartbreaking all around.
Yeah, you're left with this nagging feeling that even though there was a verdict, there are still so many unanswered questions. Did the investigation really get to the bottom of it, or was there something they missed?
Like that thing with the gunshot residue. I mean, the prosecution said Seth had time to wash his hands, but it's still weird that they never even checked.
I know, right. And what about all the time they wasted going after Brian? It makes you think about how much those biases, those first impressions, can really mess things up.
It's like they had this idea about Brian in their heads, and they just wouldn't let it go even when the evidence pointed in a different direction.
It's a good reminder that we all have those blind spots. You know, we see what we want to see. It's human nature, I guess. But it's scary to think how much damage those biases can do.
So what do you think? What are the big lessons we can learn from this case?
Well, I think it shows how fragile truth can be. You know, one minute it looks like this, the next minute it looks like that. Evidence can be twisted. Stories can change. It makes you wonder if we can ever really be sure about anything.
It definitely makes you question things. And the whole thing with Brian, it makes you realize that the justice system isn't perfect. People make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes have huge consequences.
Yeah, like in this case, those mistakes cost Brian his reputation, his peace of mind, maybe even his life. And for Seth, well, he's lost his freedom. And for what? We may never know for sure if he actually did it.
It's just a mess, and in the middle of all of it is Lisa. It's easy to forget about her with all the focus on the investigation and the trials, but she's the real victim here.
Yeah, that's true. Her life was cut short, and her family is left picking up the pieces.
It's just so sad. So where does that leave us? Do we just accept that we'll never have all the answers?
Maybe that's part of it. You know, sometimes you just have to live with the uncertainty. Maybe the real lesson is that we need to keep asking questions, keep digging for the truth, even when it's hard.
I like that, because that's what this whole deep dive is all about, right? It's about looking beyond the surface and trying to understand things a little better, even if we never get all the answers.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe by talking about these cases, by examining the mistakes and the biases, maybe we can help prevent something like this from happening again.
That's a good thought. So to everyone listening out there, keep those questions coming, keep those conversations going, because that's how we learn and that's how we grow.
And don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. You never know what you might discover.
Well said. This has been a really heavy one. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Seth Techel case.
It's been a pleasure. And until next time, keep searching for the truth.
And we'll be here to help you find it.